Hello, welcome back to the study of the book Discovering Your True Self, a Guide for the Journey. My name is Steve Langford. I'm the author of the book, and I'm the guide during this study. In this second series of videos, part 2, which corresponds to part 2 in the book, we are exploring the spiritual journey that is involved in the transformation of heart and mind into the likeness of Christ. We are looking at concepts and tools that are a part of that journey, that contribute to that journey, that help us move from, into, by means of, from the old self, as defined in Ephesians 4 and Colossians 3, into the new self by means of the renewing of the mind. In this session, we're going to look at a very foundational part of that transformation, a foundational piece to the puzzle, if you please. We're going to talk about moving from a pattern that we were trained to do and to follow in our formative years during the land of the giants. We're going to talk about moving to, and we're going to identify the means by which we do that under the power of the Spirit. From, let's talk about the from. From the old self, and from the patterns that we learned that help to manufacture this persona, this constructed self. You'll remember that in the land of the giants, when during our formative years, we were trained to do 4 things. We were trained to focus our attention on others. In focusing on others, we were trained to focus particularly upon and pay attention to their emotions, their emotional disposition, what they were feeling in the moment. The third thing was that we were led to believe that we were somehow responsible for what the giants were feeling in the moment, whether they were happy and pleased, or whether they were frustrated and angry, or whether they were sad, or whether they were afraid. And in being trained to feel responsible for what they were feeling, it communicated to us that we somehow had power or control over what they were feeling. Which led to the fourth thing. We attempted then to control others in order to get them to meet our needs. This focus upon others trained us to look to others to make sure our needs were met. These 4 patterns are generally unrecognized, and as a result, we come into adulthood with those same 4 patterns. As adults, we learn to focus on others. We become sensitive to, we read body language, we read emotions, we read dispositions. In our focus on others, we continue to attempt to control others. We attempt to control how they think about us and what they feel about us and how they respond to us. Some of us go even further to try to control what they think and what they do. We try to control their lives. And in doing so, we assume responsibility for the other, for what is theirs. And in that kind of being responsible for what belongs to another, and that kind of trying to control the other, we create unhealthy relationships. We create relationships that are unhealthy. We create relationships that are often filled with conflict, as 2 people are trying to control the other, or being responsible for what belongs to the other, or trying to tell the other person what to do. Or we create relationships that are afraid of conflict, and as a result they avoid all kinds of anger and all kinds of conflict, and in doing so Issues are never addressed. They're pushed down beneath the surface, and emotions are discounted and avoided, ignored. Unhealthy relationships are often unequal relationships, in which one person is dominant in the relationship and the other person adapts to them, so that there is an inequality. In fact, one seemingly overshadows the other and calls the shots and sets the emotional tone. An unhealthy relationship, an unequal relationship. Now, the means of what we're attempting to do is to move from unhealthy relationships into healthy relationships, obviously. But not just healthy relationships. We want to move into meaningful relationships. We want to move into relationships where the needs, the four basic needs of both parties are met. We want to create a relationship which is safe for both, and which both feel connected, in which both are valued for who they are and respected for what they can do. We want to move into relationships where there is an equality, where there is a give and a receiving of mutuality. And the means by which we move from these healthy relationships out of the unhealthy relationships is by a concept called boundaries. Boundaries are the secret. Emotional, relational boundaries are the secret to healthy relationships. Boundaries are like fences. Fences on property identify what is mine, where my property ends, and what is yours, where your property begins. And if it's on my side of the fence, it belongs to me, and so I'm responsible for it, and I have power over it. But if it's on the other side of the fence, it doesn't belong to me. That means it belongs to somebody else, and they're responsible for it, and they alone have power or control over what happens on their side. Boundaries are like fences. They identify ownership. They identify responsibility. And they identify power or control. They identify what is mine, what I'm responsible for, and what I have power or control over. Boundaries can be identified as being healthy and in place or being violated by three simple questions. Whose is it? Is it mine? Who is responsible for it? If it is mine, then I'm responsible for it, not someone else. The third question, who has power or control over it? And if it is mine, then I'm responsible for it, and I alone have power or control over it. The answer to those three questions must be the same if the boundaries are in place, if the boundaries are healthy, if the boundaries are strong. The problem is this focus upon others, this feeling responsible for what others feel, this attempt to control what others feel, this attempt to get the others to meet our needs, trained us to live with unhealthy boundaries. In fact, without any boundaries at all. And as a result, we have the tendency to make other people responsible for what is ours. This is especially true when we get emotionally reactive, when our emotions get stirred up, when we get angry or afraid. Our tendency is to make them responsible for what we're feeling. They pushed our buttons, they jerked our chain, and so we blame them for what we are experiencing. But the reality is, if I'm the one experiencing it, if it is my emotion, if it's my emotional reaction, then I'm the one responsible for it. and I'm the only one who has any control over it. I call this making other people responsible for what belongs to mine. I call that dumping. I dump on them. Another way we do that is with expectations. We carry expectations of the other that we want them to measure up to, and so we dump our expectations on them, expecting them to meet them. That's foundational to the constructed self. Another way that we violate boundaries is attempting to be responsible for what belongs to another. I call this robbing. I rob another of what is rightfully theirs. Parents are notorious for this. How many of us as parents have tried to be responsible for our children's homework? Did they get it done? Did they come home with it? And then did they get it done? And then did they get it turned in? Somehow or another, we're trying to be responsible for what belongs to them, their homework. And often, it is because we're afraid that their grades will reflect on us. It is a boundary violation in which we try to be responsible for what belongs to someone else. Those of us who like to give advice, those of us who like to be so helpful, are quite frequently owning responsibility for what belongs to another. And you see, this pattern can set up a very unhealthy pattern in relationships. Because when I'm being responsible for what belongs to someone else, then I am over-functioning. I'm the strong one. And as long as I carry the responsibility, they don't have to. And I'm training them to live under-responsible, to not be responsible for what belongs to them. And this over-functioning, under-functioning relationship pattern is a very common one. In fact, quite frequently, those of us who over-function and own responsibility for what belongs to another are often critical of those who don't carry the responsibility. You see, healthy relationships require that we learn to recognize and live with healthy boundaries. Recognizing what is mine and what's not, so that I can be responsible for what is mine and quit trying to be responsible for what is somebody else's, or blaming somebody else for what is I'm responsible for. And using my power to be responsible for that which is mine. Healthy boundaries are foundational to healthy relationships. Without healthy boundaries, there can be no healthy relationships. There can be no equal relationships. There can be no relationship in which the emotional needs of both parties are met. Healthy boundaries are foundational. The Spirit of God is the one who empowers us to move beyond this lack of boundaries into living with healthy boundaries. We move from unhealthy relationships into healthy relationships through the exercise of healthy boundaries. Healthy boundaries moves us beyond blaming others. Healthy boundaries teaches us to respect others. But most importantly, healthy boundaries teaches us to be responsible for ourselves. It teaches us to be self-responsible. Look with me at what it means to be self-responsible. Understanding and living with healthy boundaries puts me in a position to be self-responsible. What that means is that I am responsible for what belongs to me, and I learn how to use my abilities, my power, my control to manage me. I move beyond that pattern we learned in the land of the giants to try to control others so that they will meet my needs, to try to control others so that they will make me feel safe, or that I will feel like I'm loved and belonged, or that I'm valued, or that I'm capable. I move beyond trying to get others to meet my needs and learned to manage myself so that I can negotiate to get my needs met without being deceptive, without being manipulative, without being controlling. Self-responsible is being responsible for what is mine and using my power and ability to manage what is mine. Being self-responsible positions us to practice self-management. Self-management is what the Apostle Paul calls in the fruit of the Spirit, Galatians 5:22-23. It's what he calls self-control. It is learning to manage myself. It is learning to control what is mine, particularly my emotional reactivity. When someone hits my button, when someone triggers an emotional reaction in me, to be self-responsible means that I can manage that I recognize it and manage it. Self-management is possible because of self-awareness. Self-awareness means that I recognize what is going on inside of me emotionally. I recognize when I'm anxious. I recognize when I'm afraid, or when I'm angry, or when I'm negative. I recognize when I'm hurting and when I'm grieving. I recognize what's going on inside of me so that I can manage it. Self-awareness is only possible or is enhanced through self-knowledge. The more I know myself, the more I know about my persona, the self that I manufactured and constructed, the more I know what my issues are, the more I know what my primary need is, what my dominant fear is, the more I know the anxiety that drives me, self-knowledge, then the more I can be aware of it when it kicks in, when that emotional reactivity happens. And when that emotional reactivity happens, then I can work to manage it. Now notice that the Apostle Paul in the fruit of the Spirit says, now the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, generosity, faithfulness, and self-control. Self-control, managing ourselves, comes through the power of the Spirit. As the Spirit works in our life, the Spirit empowers us to manage ourselves. And here's the deal. When we learn to practice self-control, when we learn to manage the emotional reactivity going on in us, then we no longer act out of the emotion. It is quite often that the times that we violate the boundaries the most is when we are acting out our emotion. We end up dumping our emotion on the other person. But when we recognize it and take the steps through the Spirit to manage it, then that management, self-management, sets up the opportunity to change. It sets up the opportunity to grow. It sets up the opportunity to become more mature. As we change those automatic emotional reactions rooted in our primary need and our deep-seated fear, as we change those emotional reactions rooted in the fear that drives our constructed self, then we can change and grow and become different. Until we recognize these patterns, until we recognize these reactions, we're going to stay stuck. And we'll just keep repeating the same patterns over and over again and encountering the same problems in relationships over and over again. But when we have self-knowledge, that sets the stage then for self-awareness. And when that self-awareness comes, then we can practice self-control, self-management. And that self-management then leads to the opportunity for us to grow and change, for us to mature. Now the key here is managing it. We often recognize it, but how do we manage it? And I would suggest to you that the secret to managing our emotional reactivity lies in our relationship with God. It lies in the power of the Spirit. Emotional reactivity does something in the brain. When we get emotional, when we get emotionally reactive, whether it's out of anxiety and fear or anger and negativity, the blood in our brain bypasses the cerebral cortex, the thinking portion of our brain, and goes down to what is called the reptilian brain. It goes down to that part of the brain that is designed to react to keep us alive. That's why when someone pushes our button, when something triggers us, we automatically react. But with self-knowledge and self-awareness, we can bypass that automatic reaction. Recognizing it, we can choose not to follow the same reactive pattern. And the means by which we do that is by breathing prayer. When we breathe deeply from our belly, breathing in through our nose, holding it, releasing it through our mouth, that holding the breath does a reset to the brain. And it shifts the blood flow from the reactive center back to the thinking center, where we can think and make clear choices based upon principles, not old fears and old wounds. When we learn to breathe and reset the brain, then we can choose to live out of the truth of Christ, the truth that the Spirit teaches us, the spiritual truths, the ways of God. But in that process of breathing, we learn to pray. As we breathe in, we pray to the Spirit, fill me. As we exhale, we say, cleanse me. Fill me with your peace. Cleanse me of my anxiety and fear. Fill me with your joy. Cleanse me of my anger and my negativity, my criticalness and my judgmental spirit. Fill me with your love. Cleanse me of all of this emotional reactivity that's going on. And in that kind of breathing and using our breathing to pray, we shift our focus away from what is happening out there that has created the emotional reactivity in here to God. And we recenter ourselves in God and who we are as God's beloved child. We recenter ourselves in God's love and grace that provides our sense of safeness. We recenter ourselves in God's faithfulness. And we attune ourselves to the Spirit, who then empowers us to make a choice, to change, to do it differently. Boundaries, healthy boundaries, are not just the secret to healthy relationships. They're the secret to living in ways that are healthy, that empower us to be self-responsible by managing ourselves so that we respond out of God's peace and joy rather than out of our anxiety and anger. Well, it's time for you to process this information with your group and to apply and personalize it. Where do you see yourself? What is your pattern of boundary violations? Because we all have them. Personalize it and share it among yourselves so that you can pray with one another and for one another. Pray about being self-responsible so that you can live out of peace and joy and thereby love. That's what the fruit of the Spirit teaches us. We cannot love out of anxiety, fear, or anger and negativity. We can only love, choose to love, out of God's peace and out of God's joy. How do we get there? Through self-control, managing that emotional reactivity, turning to the Spirit to empower us so that we can choose from posture of peace. We can choose to live by God's truth. Well, I trust you'll be aware of the Spirit of God in your presence and the Spirit of God working in your lives. I trust you'll take these understandings, these concepts, these tools with you through the week and be aware of them, become sensitive to the patterns of relationships so that you can be conscious about choosing how you want to live. Not out of the reactivity of the old emotional wounds, but out of the truths of who we are as God's children. When we gather for our next video, we'll be dealing with the materials that you find in chapters 20 and 21. But until then, I pray that you will be able to live out of the peace of Christ, that you will be self-responsible so that you can manage yourself and access the peace of Christ, out of which you choose to love. The peace of Christ be with you.